Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we're going to be starting our new podcast, the Chronicles of the First Wars, wherein we'll be discussing the first wars between orcs and men. During said wars, the orcs came from the world of Draenor across the Dark Portal and proceeded to smash up a lot of kingdoms and nearly destroy the human kingdoms of Stormwind and Lordaeron. This conflict, which is really one war but is often divided into two, is a monstrously epic and terribly bloody conflict that leaves scars throughout the rest of the history of the Warcraft universe. Without further ado, let's jump in. Before we actually start the wars, though, we have to discuss the state of the world a little, or at least Stormwind and the Orcs, before they even discovered each other. We'll start with those of the Alliance, notably Stormwind, a kingdom that had been established 1,200 years before the events of the actual war, a kingdom that's also sometimes called the Kingdom of Azeroth. Stormwind had been probably one of the stronger kingdoms for a time. Notably, Stormwind had had two major conflicts right before the events of Warcraft 1. The first being the Null Wars, the second being the Gurubashi Wars. Now we're going to get into the Null Wars to begin with. And what these Null Wars were was a great conflict, well, obviously, with Gnolls. A remarkably unified Gnollish state of sorts had been challenged by, and was in turn challenging, the Kingdom of Stormwind. And while the typical history presents Stormwind as the defensive party and the Gnolls as the aggressors, while there is some validity to this claim, on the other hand, Stormwind had been expanding for quite some time, so that war between these two states was inevitable. Given the nature of Gnolls, one could hardly blame them for not really wanting to keep them around. What ended up happening was King Berethan Rin, who's sometimes called King Rin III, which means that his grandfather would have been the founder of this Rin dynasty. Berethan was a warrior king. He smashed the Gnolls with a great big military gambit, which paid off, and saw him heralded as a hero throughout Stormwind, and dubbed the Adamant because he wouldn't give up no matter how dire the situation got. Honestly, it's hard not to be drawn in by this character, whom I really wish they would expand the lore and give us more books and content on, because Berethan just seems like a very awesome character. After they had conquered the Gnollish state, what happened for Stormwind was that they developed into the superpower of the age as they expanded their influence. Economic trade boomed, prosperity reigned. Though the movie is not exactly canon in the same way that the games are, being set apart in a different universe, the movie does do a good job showcasing one idea, that the Kingdom of Stormwind had forged some decent political alliances with some of the other kingdoms such as Khaz Morhen and Lordaeron, and even the Kingdom of Quel'Thalas, the Kingdom of the Elves. These ties would later serve Stormwind well in the Great Wars against the Orcs that was to come. For some time, in regards to magic, there had been a buildup of problems for magicians. The Guardian of Azeroth, who primarily served Stormwind, so that Stormwind had a bit of a slanted position over the other kingdoms, who did not have a great magical force at their beck and call to do whatever they wanted. But 8 centuries prior, the previous Guardian Egwene had become contaminated with the essence of Sargeras, so that when she later gave birth to a son called Medivh, after a brief affair with the court conjurer, which goes to show the amount of favor shown towards Stormwind. Now, by this time, Egwene had served as Guardian of Azeroth for 1,000 years. Her son was, from very time he was conceived, was contaminated with part of the essence of Sargeras, with Medivh thus part demon in a way, and already bound to an extent to the Burning Legion, which still hungered for Azeroth despite Egwene having repulsed the last attempt by Sargeras to enter the world, conquer it for the Burning Legion. On the other hand, you have the Order of Mages, the Kirin Tor, who had been established quite some time before this war. They're located in Dalaran, which is closer to Lordaeron. But on the other hand, they had never had a conflict of interest, quite like what the Guardians had, in that they were not servants of Lordaeron like the Guardian of Azeroth is
To Stormwind.
Thus, the Kirin Tor still had a bit of objectivity to them. On the other hand, they had become fairly confident and complacent, kind of lowered their guard, not realizing that there was a bigger problem, even though there had been some weird activities regarding the Guardians in the past 1,000 years. So thus, it was the perfect storm of complacency on the part of certain forces, such as those of the Kirin-Tor, Stormwind to an extent. The new Guardian, he had forged a friendship with Lane and a young knight called Anduin Lothar, and the three became besties and would text each other all the time and talk about girls and have sleepovers. 21 years before the Great Wars with the Orcs, the war that saw the trio bond during was the Gurubashi War. The trouble is that after about a 50-year reign or so, the Adamant King had developed a great deal of wisdom, looked at the Gurubashi trolls, and preferred a safer, more defensive military strategy to slowly strangle the life out of the enemy. There was, however, a flaw to this better safe than sorry strategy. That is to say that the trolls had turned to Hakar the Soul Flayer, thus they have a higher power on their side. Over the course of this conflict, though, the trolls had stormed a few towns, committing, for the first time since the Null Wars, a few war atrocities against Stormwind. The trouble was that the king wanted to focus on de-escalation, was keen to avoid an all-out war between the two sides. This brought him into conflict with his son. Lane ended up challenging his father publicly, demanding that the blood of Stormwind's citizens be repaid in kind.
An impulsive youth at that time.
The trouble is, his father, Barathan, decided to rebuke his son and put an end to this complaining, so that both men publicly embarrassed themselves a little, showcasing their foibles for all and sundry, when what they ought to have done was consult with one another privately, as they both made excellent points here. This was not the time for a public confrontation, so that Lane was wrong to do that, but on the other hand, Lane's instincts were correct about the Gurubashi trolls. Assisted by Anduin Lothar, a notable soldier in the service of Stormwind, along with several others, they, along with Medivh, decided to launch a secret mission to Stranglethorn, the capital of the Gurubashi trolls. This proved foolish, and the men were forced to flee, and the trolls were angered at the slaying of their leader, so that they ended up declaring war on Stormwind, realizing that Stormwind was responsible. The trolls would end up sieging the city of Stormwind itself. Since the Null Wars, an unthinkable event. Naturally, the trouble was Daddy had to pay for the son's mostly inadvertent mistakes. And I say mostly only because it was not his intention that things should escalate like this. He was trying to deal with it quickly, but he was too impulsive. And so King Barathan Rin died on the field of battle and was to perish, sacrificing himself to try to push back the enemy. Stormwind looked as though it was going to fall. So Lane, realizing that he could not rally Stormwind, turned to Medivh and convinced him to unleash his full power, who unleashed a storm of magic that killed the majority of the Gurubashi and their leaders, and saved Stormwind. After the battle, Lane succeeded his father as King of Stormwind. If this conflict demonstrated anything, it's that the son should never have become the king. Lane was impulsive, clearly did not understand the risks of magic if he's willing to initiate such a large-scale spell with no thought to how dangerous and how quickly it could fly out of control, did not help matters. So, all in all, this was a foretaste for Stormwind of what was to come. One quick side note, Lane would end up marrying Lothar's sister. And Lothar was not some great nobleman, and this shows that Lane was his own man. He would marry who he wanted. For a king to marry well below his station, there are plenty of kings who did it historically and who did not pay the price for it. A king to know his own mind and want to do his own thing for the benefit of his people, and who doesn't think of class divides as too big a deal, is not a bad trait. So Lane has his virtues. Let's make no mistake, it's not like he has the talent of his father. Stormwind, after this, had 21 years of peace, and Lane generally sat back on the throne and enjoyed the boons of empire, of which there was plenty to be had. Not gonna judge. It was a good time for Stormwind. As to the trolls who were defeated, they were to suffer a loss to goblins in a follow-up war, which saw them lose a bit more territory. While what followed was a peaceful era, one cannot forget that Stormwind came very close to being shattered. A little too close for comfort, because the siege of Stormwind by the trolls should never have happened. The Rin dynasty had been shaken to its core with the fall of its greatest king and had begun to rebuild under Lane,
who was wise enough to heed
the wise counsels of those such as Medivh and Anduin Lothar, who did have a good mind for politics and administration. And Lane did do a good job securing the support of a great many nobles after the conflict with the Gurubashi trolls. Meanwhile, in Draenor, the Orcs, who had 1,000,001 tribes probably, who knows, there was thousands. The thing about the Orcs was that they had contented themselves with not having a civilization and just being barbarian tribes, rather like Samaria in Howard's Hyborian Age literature, with some tribes such as the Frostwolves and Blackrocks forming close ties. Just as Lane, Medivh, and them had forged a powerful bond, meanwhile on the Orc side of the fence, Orgrim, Doomhammer, and Durotan had forged a bit of a bond of their own. Though, make no mistake, politically the Blackrock had the upper hand, because they had a powerful chieftain in Orgrim Doomhammer, where Durotan was to be a fairly decent chieftain who cared more for his meat and spending time with his wife and generally not causing too much trouble and defending his people, which these are commendable attributes. And Durotan was to be one of them that would have great reservations about the unification of many of the Orc tribes later, and about who was unifying them, with good reason. So there was some sense between his ears. We do have to give Durotan that much. Orgrim Doomhammer, though, saw things, I suspect, in a different way. He saw opportunity. He was the most greedy and ambitious in some ways.
This is part of what makes him so awesome.
The thing is, the tribes were unifying under an orc who was quite formidable called Blackhand. And Blackhand was apparently uniting all the tribes under himself and had declared himself war chief. I guess you could say great Khan or great king or high king or emperor of all the horde. This was a momentous occasion for the orcs. They finally could start to build a civilization. There were two problems. One, Blackhand was actually not really anyone in it too important. He was just a middleman for someone far more powerful, far more dangerous. Someone who had turned the Orcs to service of the Burning Legion, having formed a deal with the Burning Legion. This individual was Gul'dan, a Fel mage who used the power of the Fel, that is to say, necromantic magics, using the life force of others to power himself up. Having been taught by the Burning Legion, he would then use the blood of Manoroth, one of the dark gods of the Burning Legion, to corrupt some of the other Orcs into his service. And Gul'dan, he was a flunky of the Burning Legion. And so his goal was not simply to just conquer one world. No, he wanted to move to the next world. There was also a very good reason for why the Orcs would want to move out. Shortly after the appearance of Gul'dan, Draenor began to die because the life force was quite literally being sucked out of it. They had to leave. Otherwise, they would perish.
No food, no water.
Yeah, there was limited resources left and too many orcs. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of orcs. Not a good situation to be in. So I don't think we should judge them too harshly for the decision they made. Many of the orcs that were to travel into Azeroth did not come as warriors. That is to say, they came as an immigrating group of farmers, traders, and hunters. They came to build families and start new lives. On the other hand, the Orcs were not simply a farming, peaceful society. They were warlike. Well, their leader is a war chief, so Stormwind might have been able to find a good place for them along the frontier and leave them there. Maybe putting them between themselves and the Trolls to serve as a bit of a frontier. And I think the Orcs would have been a little satisfied with this. But the trouble was Gul'dan. Contrary to the previous war, it was not Lane who sought war, but rather war was inevitable because Gul'dan.
Had it not been for Gul'dan, they would have been able to possibly communicate, diplomatically defuse the situation.
You had Blackhand, who was all muscle and no brains, and just a front man for Gul'dan, who had brains and spades, and frankly makes Luca Blight look like a fairly warm, receptive guy you bring to Christmas dinner. Gul'dan, though, was himself just a front man for the Burning Legion. He could not just simply open the Dark Portal. It had to be opened from both sides. Azeroth was betrayed by Medivh, the Guardian, so that Medivh opened it on the side of Azeroth for the Burning Legion, and Gul'dan opened it on the side of Draenor for the Burning Legion. This was a very well orchestrated event on the part of Sargeras, demonstrating his immense tactical and strategic know-how and the amount of patience the Burning Legion had to have waited about 1,000 years for this. after their last attempt was forwarded by Egwin, the previous guardian. There were already the seeds for a shakeup on both sides. Lane was not the most competent king. Anduin Lothar was in some ways the more competent man and the more formidable one, to be quite honest. You had Medivh, who was struggling to shake off the influence of Sargeras and not really doing too good a job. On the Orc side, the formidable Doomhammer already eyeing the position of Blackhand. And I do think he was eyeing it from the very beginning, going, we have a war chief. All we need is for him to be replaced with someone from the Blackrock tribe. Someone with a big hammer, with a more masculine spirit, who's physically stronger and smarter.
And better.
Someone like Orgrim Doomhammer. So that you have on one side Stormwind, which is fairly unified, and you already have amongst the Orcs division under the surface. But accompanying Gul'dan would be his secret weapon for taking down Lane, Garona.
I know there were rumors of vengeful spirits, trolls, which somehow got new power, and some great race from across the Great Sea.
Oh yeah, these kind of omens haunting the frontiers and parts of the Stormwind Kingdom and whatnot, and around the Black Morass. Yeah, that part of the lore reminds me a bit of the rumors and omens right before the death of Alexander the Great, and even Philip II of Macedon. You really get a sense that there are a lot of characters are not heeding the signs that there's something dark on the horizon. To an extent, the seeds for this war were planted 823 years before the First War, with Egwin's supposed defeat of Sargeras. To another extent, they were planted more recently. They're there to kind of hint at the darkness that's coming, and to show the folly of those who aren't heeding the signs. We'll probably end up doing videos on some of the individual characters and their journey across the Great War between Orcs and humans, but that'll come after we cover the next few chapters of the in-universe story of the beginning of the war between Orcs and men. And it is a really interesting story, and the conflict quickly heats up on both sides.
Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button as though you were Doomhammer smashing Blackhand.